In the vast, unforgiving prairies of Montana, a woman's solitude is broken by a stranger arriving during a storm. What begins as reluctant shelter becomes an unexpected journey of healing as two souls scarred by loss discover that even in the harshest wilderness, love can take root and flourish. If this tale of resilience and second chances touches your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to join our storytelling community. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear which corner of the world our stories have reached today. The wind blew untamed over the Montana prairies, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the whisper of golden wheat stalks that swayed like a terrestrial sea. Clara Whitmore contemplated the horizon from the weathered porch of her log cabin, a structure as resilient and solitary as herself. Her eyes, the pale green color of young willows, scrutinized the line where the sky kissed the earth with the sharpness of someone who had learned to read storms before they formed. 23 winters had carved a premature hardness in her. Her hands, small but calloused, held a coffee cup that no longer steamed. The black, bitter liquid was like her days, strong, unadorned, necessary. Since her father's death, 2 years ago now, routine had become her only faithful companion. Waking, with the first ray of sun, feeding the chickens, checking the fences, keeping the coyotes at bay, and above all, bearing the weight of solitude that settled on her shoulders with the same consistency as snow on rooftops in December. The cabin kept the echoes of a life that no longer existed. Samuel Whitmore's worn boots remained by the door, as if at any moment he would put them on to go check on the cattle. His Winchester rifle hung above the fireplace, though now it was Clara who took it down each morning to carry with her on her rounds of the property. It wasn't just protection, it was an extension of her father, a tangible reminder of his teachings. "The land takes care of you if you take care of it, little one," he had told her once, as they planted corn seeds together. In spring, but never forget that nature doesn't distinguish between kindness and cruelty. It only recognizes strength and persistence, and Clara had proven to have both qualities in abundance. The nearest neighbors, miles away, had bet she wouldn't last. One winter alone. Now, after surviving 2, they no longer bet. They just nodded with distant respect when they saw her come to town to trade eggs for flour or sell the wool from her sheep. The sky began to darken to the west, turning a leaden gray that announced a storm. Clara breathed deeply, absorbing the electric smell of the air. Her senses, honed by solitude, caught the subtlest changes in the environment. The sudden silence of the birds, the restlessness of the horses in the stable, the almost imperceptible pressure in her temples. She stood up with precise movements, economizing energy as she had learned to economize everything else. There was wood to store, windows to secure, animals to protect. The ritual of preparation before the storm was one she knew by heart, a solitary dance with steps marked by necessity and the instinct for survival. While securing the shutters of the bedroom window, her eyes stopped on the small cracked mirror, hanging above the dresser. She barely recognized herself in it. Her face, with soft features framed by brown hair she usually wore tied in a practical braid, seemed to belong to someone else. A girl who had once dreamed of something more than simply enduring. A different Clara, who had imagined a life where silence was not her only confidant. Thunder rumbled in the distance, bringing her back to the present. There was no time for musings. Survival demanded constant attention, and nostalgia was a luxury she couldn't afford. Clara Whitmore had a cabin to maintain, a land to defend, and a silent promise to fulfill to a father who was no longer there. The rifle always at hand, and silence as company. That was her life now. Outside, the first drop of rain hit the roof, with the forcefulness of a portent. The storm unleashed with a fury that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The water fell vertically, relentless, turning the yard into a quagmire and the entrance path into an improvised stream. Clara had lit the kerosene lamp, its warm light casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls as she mended socks, her fingers moving with the methodical precision that characterized all her gestures. The first knock on the door was so faint that, for a moment, she thought she had imagined it, confusing it with the crackling of wood in the hearth. The second, however, was unmistakable. Clara left the needle stuck in the fabric, and with a fluid movement born of instinct, took the rifle that rested against the chair. She approached the window stealthily, pulling aside just a corner of the curtain. Through the foggy glass and the curtain of rain, she made out a dark silhouette, a man on horseback hunched under the weight of the downpour. The animal was visibly limping, and the rider seemed to struggle to stay upright. Clara pressed her lips together. Strangers rarely brought anything good. Her father had warned her, and the experience of other solitary women in those wild lands confirmed it. But she also knew that denying shelter to someone on a night like this could be equivalent to a death sentence. With the rifle firmly held in her hands, she opened the door just enough to speak, keeping her body protected behind. "The wood. What are you looking for?" Her voice sounded firmer than she expected, projecting above the roar of the rain. The man raised his face. His features were marked by fatigue and several days' beard that failed to hide a scar crossing his left cheek. His eyes, an intense blue, seemed almost grey under the gloom of the storm. "Excuse the intrusion, miss," he spoke with an accent that revealed his southern origin. "My horse has lost a shoe, and we're looking for shelter until the storm subsides. I'm headed to Fort Benton, with furs to trade." Clara studied the stranger. His coat, though worn, had an unmistakable military cut. The war had ended years ago, but its scars remained present in the men who had survived to tell about it. She also noticed the loaded saddlebags on the horse's mount, confirming his story about the furs. The rain intensified, and the man was beginning to visibly shiver. Clara made a decision. "You can spend the night in the barn," she pointed with a gesture toward the structure that could be glimpsed a few meters from the cabin. "There's dry hay for your horse and blankets in the loft. There's stew in the pot. You can help yourself, but don't enter the house without knocking." The man nodded with evident relief. "I'm very grateful to you, Miss Whitmore," she responded dryly. "Clara Whitmore." "Elias Boone," he introduced himself, slightly inclining his head in a gesture that seemed to belong to another era, to another world more civilized than these wild prairies. "I promise it will only be tonight. I'll leave at dawn, if the weather permits." Clara didn't respond. She simply closed the door, shot the bolt, and returned to her chair by the fire. The rifle remained within her reach all night, while her ears stayed alert to any sound coming from outside. The stew she had mentioned was rather thin, just some potatoes, carrots, and a bit of dried meat. Survival food, not hospitality. But it was what she had to offer, and more than many would have given to a stranger in lands where distrust was as necessary as water. That night, Clara slept little and poorly. Her sleep, usually light, became fragmented, plagued with disconnected images. Her father cleaning the rifle, the storm lashing the fields, and blue eyes that seemed to look at her from the shadows with a disturbing intensity. Outside, the rain continued to fall relentless all night long. Dawn brought with it a clear sky but flooded terrain. Clara went out to the porch, rifle in hand as every morning, and observed the ravages of the storm. The stream that bounded her property to the east had overflowed, flooding part of the low meadow where the sheep usually grazed. The north fence, always the weakest, had given way in a stretch, and the chicken coop had lost part of its roof. Her eyes inevitably turned toward the barn. The door was ajar, and a thin column of smoke rose from the small side chimney that her father had built for the harshest winters. The stranger was still there. She decided to tend to her animals first. The chickens, agitated by the storm, needed to be fed and calmed. While throwing them grain, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." Elias Boone's voice sounded clearer in the daylight. "I regret to inform you that I won't be able to leave today as I had promised. My horse is worse than I thought." Clara turned slowly. The man seemed different, without the rain blurring his contours. He was tall, taller than she had estimated the night before, with broad shoulders that revealed a life of physical work. His clothes, though worn, were carefully clean, and he had shaved, completely revealing the scar that crossed his cheek, a fine white line like a river drawn on a map. "What's wrong with the horse?" she asked, maintaining her distance. "The lost shoe has damaged his hoof. He'll need at least 2 or 3 days to recover enough to endure the journey to Fort Benton." Clara frowned. She hadn't counted on a guest for so long. The idea made her uncomfortable, but she couldn't simply throw him out with an injured animal. Besides, the storm had left enough damage to keep her busy for days. "You can stay until your horse improves," she said finally, "but you'll have to earn your stay." Elias Boone sketched a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, I wouldn't expect any less. How can I help?" Clara looked around, evaluating. "Priorities. The north fence is broken. There are tools in the shed." He nodded without questioning or complaining and headed toward where she had pointed. Clara watched him walk away, noticing for the first time that he limped slightly on his left leg, another mark of the war, she supposed. The day passed in a strange rhythm of parallel work. While Clara repaired the chicken coop, she could see Elias working on the fence, methodical and silent. He didn't ask unnecessary questions or try to make conversation, something she silently appreciated. By noon, both had established a kind of tacit truce, two loners sharing the space, but not much more. Clara prepared a simple lunch, stale bread soaked in milk and some strips of jerky. She hesitated a moment before calling him to eat, but finally did so. They sat on the porch at a prudent distance, each focused on their plate. "You have good land," he commented after a long silence, looking toward the fields that stretched to the horizon. "Difficult to maintain for one person alone." Clara chewed slowly before responding. "It was my father's. Now it's mine. And I manage." Elias nodded, catching the subtext. She didn't need compassion or comments on her situation. "My family had a farm in Tennessee," he said, surprising her with the unsolicited revelation. "Smaller than this, but enough to live on. It no longer exists. The war." He said it like someone stating a meteorological fact, without self-pity, without drama. Clara looked at him sideways, recognizing in that stoic acceptance something familiar, an echo of her own way of facing losses. "The war took many things," she responded, allowing herself for the first time a comment that went beyond what was strictly necessary. Elias Boone raised his gaze. His blue eyes met hers, and for an instant, something invisible but tangible seemed to flow between them, the mutual recognition of those who have survived pain. "Yes," he said simply. "Too many." They went back to eating in silence, but something had changed. The air between them had become less tense, as if those few words had dissolved a layer of ice, thin but perceptible. That night, when Clara brought him an additional blanket to the barn, the temperature had dropped abruptly after the storm, she no longer carried the rifle with her. A small gesture, a first step toward something that neither of them could name yet. The initial 3 days turned into 5, then 7. Elias's horse was improving, but slowly. Clara knew he could have already left, but she didn't mention the subject. The truth, barely admitted in the solitude of her nightly thoughts, was that his presence had begun to prove useful. More than useful, necessary. Elias had repaired not only the north fence, but also the chicken coop roof, had cut enough firewood for 2 weeks, and had built a drainage system to prevent rainwater from accumulating near the foundations of the cabin. He worked with the silent efficiency of someone who is accustomed to fending for himself, without boasting about his achievements or seeking approval. During the mornings, each took care of their tasks. In the afternoons, they sometimes worked together. It was during one of those shared moments when Clara began to notice the details, the way Elias's hands, large and calloused, treated each object with surprising care, how his body seemed to relax when he worked with wood, the way he hummed very low, almost inaudibly, melodies that she didn't recognize. That afternoon they were in the stable. Clara's mule, a stubborn and skittish animal named Penny, needed to be shod. Normally Clara had to take her to town for the blacksmith to handle, a trip she detested because of the looks and barely disguised comments from the men. "I can do it," offered Elias when she mentioned the problem. "I worked as a blacksmith's assistant before the war." Clara watched him approach Penny cautiously. The mule, normally distrustful of strangers, nervously flicked her ears. "Careful, she bites," warned Clara, "and kicks." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he began to talk to the mule in a low voice, a constant murmur of words that Clara couldn't quite make out. He approached slowly, with his hands always visible, his movements fluid and predictable. Penny snorted but didn't back away. "That's "It, pretty girl," she heard him say. "I'm not going to hurt you, I just want to help you." To Clara's amazement, the mule allowed Elias to stroke her neck and then gradually to examine her legs. The man worked with a delicacy that contrasted with his robust appearance, constantly talking to the animal in that low, reassuring tone. Clara leaned against the wall of the stable, observing the scene with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. There was something revealing in the way Elias treated Penny, not as an obstacle to overcome or a tool to use, but as a being whose trust had to be earned. "You have good hands," she commented when Elias finally stood up, after having completely examined the mule. He looked at her, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "My grandfather used to say that hands speak more clearly than the mouth," he responded, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "Animals understand that language better than ours." Clara nodded, thinking about how much hands revealed about people, her father's, always firm but fair, the town doctor's, precise but cold, her mother's, which she barely remembered, soft despite the work, and now this man's strong but capable of an unexpected gentleness. "I'll need some materials for the horseshoes," continued Elias. "I can improvise with what's here, but it won't last long." "I'll go to town tomorrow," decided Clara. "I'll bring what you need." Elias nodded and returned to focusing on Penny, caressing her muzzle with a gesture that seemed natural, as if he had been doing it for years. The mule surprisingly pushed her head against the man's hand, seeking more contact. Something stirred inside Clara as she witnessed that scene, an emotion for which she had no name. She realized it was the first time in a long time that someone else was caring for something that belonged to her, sharing the burden of responsibility. The feeling was as strange as it was comforting. That night, as they ate the stew that Elias had prepared, surprising her with the flavor he had managed to extract from such simple ingredients, Clara found herself watching his hands as he cut the bread. Hands that knew how to build and repair, that could calm a skittish mule, that cooked with unexpected skill, hands that spoke a language that, without knowing it, she had begun to listen to. The trip to town was different with Elias riding beside her. Clara used to make these journeys alone, tense and alert, fulfilling what was strictly necessary before returning to the safety of her isolation. But the silent presence of the man to her right altered the dynamics in subtle ways. The town of Silver Creek barely deserved such a name. A dusty main street with a dozen buildings, a small wooden church, and a saloon that served as a tavern, meeting place, and occasionally a dance hall. The general store run by the Pearson brothers was their main destination. Upon dismounting in front of the establishment, Clara noticed the curious gazes that settled on them. It had been months since she had been seen with company, let alone male company. Rumors would soon spread like wildfire in dry grass. "Wait here," she told Elias. "It will be quicker if I go in alone." He nodded without protest, though Clara could see that he had caught the tension in her voice. The bell above the door tinkled when she entered the store, announcing her presence. Martha Pearson, the wife of the elder of the brothers, looked up from the counter. Her expression of professional courtesy quickly transformed into poorly disguised curiosity. "Clara Whitmore, what a surprise to see you here so soon," commented the woman, smoothing her apron. "Do you need something special?" "Good morning, Mrs. Pearson," replied Clara, maintaining a neutral tone. "I need materials for horseshoes and some provisions." While she enumerated what she needed, she heard the doorbell again. She didn't need to turn to know that Elias had entered, contravening her indication. She confirmed it upon seeing how Martha Pearson's eyes opened slightly, fixing on a point above Clara's shoulder. "Good morning, ma'am." Elias's voice sounded polite but firm. Clara turned, giving him a look that mixed irritation and resignation. He imperceptibly shrugged, as if apologizing without words. "And who is your companion, Miss Whitmore?" asked Martha, not bothering to disguise her interest. "Elias Boone," he introduced himself, slightly inclining his head. "I'm passing through to Fort Benton. Miss Whitmore had the kindness to offer me shelter during the storm, and my horse Suffy eared an injury." His explanation, offered naturally, contained enough truth to be credible without revealing unnecessary details. Clara internally thanked him for his discretion. "I understand," responded Martha, though her tone suggested that she understood much more. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Mr. Boone. Have you served in the army? You have the bearing." The question, apparently innocent, was loaded with intention. In those lands, loyalty during the war still largely defined how a man was perceived. Elias held the woman's gaze without flinching. "Yes, ma'am, I served with the Confederates under General Johnston." A tense silence followed his declaration. Martha Pearson slightly pressed her lips. "My husband and his brother fought for the Union," she commented, her voice now notably colder. "Then, they were fortunate men to be on the winning side," responded Elias calmly. "The war ended long ago, Mrs. Pearson. We all lost something in it." Clara observed the exchange, surprised by Elias's direct honesty. It would have been easier for him to lie or evade the question. Instead, he had chosen to confront prejudices head-on, without apologizing for his past, but also not exhibiting it as a challenge. Martha didn't respond directly, limiting herself to nodding briefly before refocusing on Clara. "I'll prepare what you need," she said, moving toward the back store. While they waited, Clara felt Elias's gaze on her. When she turned, she found his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that disconcerted her. "What?" she asked in a low voice. "Nothing," he responded, averting his gaze. "I was just thinking that it must be difficult." "What is?" "Coming here, enduring the looks, the questions." Clara tensed. She wasn't accustomed to someone perceiving what she felt, much less expressing it out loud. "I don't need your compassion, Mr. Boone." "It's not compassion," he replied in a calm voice. "It's recognition. I know what it's like to be judged for the choices one has made, or for those one has had to make." Before Clara could respond, Martha returned with the requested materials. The rest of the transaction took place in a silence barely interrupted by the necessary exchange about prices and quantities. Upon leaving the store, Clara knew they had given the Pearson brothers enough material to fuel gossip for weeks. The idea should have bothered her more, but she discovered that she cared less than expected. They mounted again and set off on the return journey in silence. It was only when they had left the last houses of the town behind when Elias spoke again. "I'm sorry if my presence complicated things." Clara kept her gaze fixed on the road. It doesn't matter, they would talk anyway. They rode a stretch more before she added, "Why did you tell them the truth? About the war? You could have spared yourself trouble." Elias took a moment to respond as if he were carefully weighing his words. "I carry my scars, Miss Whitmore, some visible, others not. They are part of who I am. I've learned that it's simpler to show them than to try to hide them." Clara thought about her own scars, those that weren't seen but that she felt every day. The absence of her father, the solitude chosen out of necessity, the weight of maintaining the land by herself. "I suppose you're right," she finally conceded. "Though sometimes scars provoke more questions than one wants to answer." Elias looked at her sideways, and a slight smile appeared on his lips. "True. But they also reveal a lot about who we are and what we have survived." They didn't speak again for the rest of the journey, but the silence between them had acquired a new quality. It was the silence of those who have begun to recognize each other beyond the surface, of those who begin to glimpse the scars hidden beneath the skin. And in that silent recognition, something indefinable but warm began to grow. The arrival of summer transformed the prairies. What before were fields of tender green became an undulating sea of golden ears and wildflowers that dotted the landscape with brushstrokes of color. The air filled with the constant buzz of insects and the trilling of birds that had returned. After winter, Elias was still there. His horse's shoe had been repaired weeks ago, and both knew there was no objective reason for him to continue on Clara's property. Neither mentioned this fact. He had simply moved from the barn to a small annex next to the tool shed, a space that he himself had conditioned with an improvised bed and a rudimentary table. Each day, Elias found a new task that justified his permanence: an irrigation system for the garden, a new corral for the sheep, the repair of the old windmill that had been years without functioning. Clara didn't question these projects, though sometimes she surprised herself looking for new tasks to suggest, new reasons for him to stay one more day. That morning, Clara woke up with the first rays of sun. From her window, she could see Elias, already working in the yard, splitting wood with rhythmic and precise movements. She allowed herself to observe him for a moment, noticing how the morning light drew golden contours around his figure. During breakfast, shared as usual in silence but without discomfort, Clara made a decision. "There's a place," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "A place I never go to alone." Elias looked up from his coffee, waiting for her to continue. "A grove of wild plum trees on the other side of the stream," she elaborated, feeling a strange nervousness. "My father used to take me there when I was a little girl. Afterwards, I never went back." She didn't need to explain more. Elias understood what she wasn't saying, that this place held memories that hurt and comforted in equal parts, that it was too precious to face alone. "Would you like to go today?" he asked, with a softness that contrasted with his robust appearance. "The weather seems suitable." Clara nodded, feeling an inexplicable relief at his understanding without questions. They left after lunch, when the sun had already dissipated the morning dew. Clara rode Penny, the mule that, thanks to Elias's care, had become surprisingly docile. He rode his own horse, now fully recovered. The stream, though still flowing strongly after the spring rains, could be crossed without danger, at a point where the rocks formed a kind of natural ford. On the other side, the terrain began to rise, gently, and the vegetation became denser. "It's this way," indicated Clara, taking a path barely visible among the tall grass. "I don't think anyone else comes around these parts." The path wound around a gentle hill until it led into a clearing protected by a semicircle of gnarled trees. The wild plum trees, with their twisted trunks and branches extended like arms reaching for the sky, created a natural vault over a small circular space where the grass grew greener and thicker. Some early flowers already announced the future harvest of plums. Clara dismounted and advanced slowly toward the center of the clearing. Her fingers brushed the rough bark of one of the trees in a gesture that seemed like a caress to an old friend. Elias remained a few steps back, giving her space, instinctively understanding the importance of the moment. "My father and I used to come here every summer," Clara spoke, her voice mingling with the whisper of the leaves stirred by the breeze. "We collected plums to make preserves. He taught me to climb these trees when I was 7 years old." She paused, and a fleeting smile illuminated her face, like a ray of sun slipping between clouds. "Once I got stuck on that branch," she pointed to a particularly twisted fork in one of the largest trees. "I was so scared that I couldn't move. My father didn't bring me down immediately. Instead, he sat under the tree and told me stories until I calmed down enough to find my way back by myself." Elias approached a little closer, his gaze following the direction Clara indicated. "A wise man," he commented in a low voice. "He taught you to trust yourself." Clara nodded, surprised by the precision with which he had captured the essence of that memory. "He was the most patient person I've ever known," she continued, the words flowing with unusual freedom. "Capable of waiting hours for prey when hunting, or observing the sky throughout an entire night to predict the next day's weather. He taught me to listen to the earth, to read its signs." She turned to Elias, meeting his attentive eyes. "And your father?" she asked, returning the trust he had shown her. "What was he like?" A shadow briefly crossed Elias's face. "A hard man," he responded after a moment. "Fair but inflexible. He believed in work, duty, and little else. He never understood why I liked to carve wood or read poetry when there were pending chores." He paused, and his eyes lost themselves in the horizon, as if searching for something in the distance. "He didn't approve of me joining the Confederates," he continued. "He said it was a lost cause from the beginning. He was right, of course." "Why did you do it then?" asked Clara, aware that she was entering intimate territory, but unable to contain her curiosity. Elias breathed deeply before responding. "For my younger brother, Jacob. He enlisted as soon as he turned 16, lying about his age. He was idealistic, impetuous. I was 23 and knew he wouldn't survive alone. So I followed him to protect him." His voice faded, and Clara knew without need for more words that he had not managed to fulfill that purpose. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Elias nodded, accepting her compassion without resistance. "Sometimes I wonder why I survived," And he didn't, he confessed, the vulnerability naked in his voice. What purpose there is in my still being here when he, who had so many dreams, so much life ahead of him, is gone? Clara took a step toward him, reducing the physical distance between them as a reflection of the emotional distance they had just shortened. Perhaps there is no purpose, she responded softly. It just happens, like storms or droughts. Some things simply are. Elias looked at her with an intensity that made Clara feel an unexpected warmth in her cheeks. Maybe you're right, he conceded. Or maybe we create the purpose ourselves day by day, with what we choose to do with the time we have. A silence loaded with meaning settled between them, interrupted only by the song of an invisible bird among the branches. Clara was suddenly aware of how close they were, of how she could distinguish the different shades of blue in Elias's eyes, of how her own breathing had become more shallow. "I've never been kissed," the words escaped her lips before she could contain them. In a whisper barely audible, Elias showed no surprise, as if that confession were something natural, expected. "Would you like to change that?" he asked in a deep voice. Clara didn't respond with words. She simply closed her eyes and raised her face slightly toward him, in a gesture as old as time itself. Elias's lips found hers with infinite delicacy, barely a brush at first, as if he feared she might break. Clara felt something unfold within. Her, like the wings of a bird long caged. Her hands, unsure, found support in his arms, feeling beneath her fingers the comforting solidity of his presence. The kiss, brief but revealing, ended as gently as it had begun. When Clara opened her eyes, she found Elias looking at her with a mixture of tenderness and respect that moved her deeply. "Let's take it slow," he murmured, repeating without knowing it the promise that Clara had imagined so many times in her most secret dreams. She nodded, unable to articulate words but feeling that something fundamental had changed in her world, as if the sky had acquired a new shade of blue, or as if the earth beneath her feet had shifted imperceptibly toward an unknown but promising course. In the grove of wild plum trees, under the immutable gaze of centennial trees, Clara Whitmore had found something she didn't know she was looking for, and Elias Boone, perhaps, had begun to glimpse a purpose. The days that followed the kiss in the grove passed in a strange dance of approach and prudence. Nothing had changed in the daily routine of the farm. They continued working side by side, sharing meals on the porch, maintaining their separate spaces when night fell. And yet everything was different. It was in the gazes that lingered a second longer than necessary, in fingers that brushed when passing tools or plates, in silences that were no longer walls but bridges. Clara discovered that she could read Elias's nonverbal language better and better, the way he rubbed the scar on his cheek when he was thoughtful, how he hummed almost inaudibly when work satisfied him, the way his posture relaxed when she entered his field of vision. One afternoon, while they worked together in the garden, digging furrows for an irrigation system that Elias had designed, Clara found herself studying his hands that had wielded weapons in the war, that had carved wood with delicacy, that had touched her face with infinite softness. "What are you thinking?" Elias's voice interrupted her reflections. Clara blinked, returning to the present. "About erosion," she responded, finding a truth that she hadn't recognized until articulating it. About how water, patient and constant, can change the shape of the land, create furrows where there were none before. It wasn't exactly a lie. The system they were building had precisely the purpose of controlling that erosion, of directing it for the benefit of their crops. But both knew she was talking about something more. Elias put the shovel aside and sat on the edge of the furrow they had just dug. The afternoon sun bathed his face with a golden light that softened his marked features. "Erosion can be destructive or constructive," he commented, taking a handful of earth and letting it run through his fingers. "It depends on how it's managed, on whether it's feared or accepted as a natural part of the landscape." Clara sat beside him at a prudent distance, but less than she would have maintained weeks ago. "My father always fought against it," she remembered, looking toward the fields that stretched before them. Every spring he repaired the damage from the thaw, cursing how the water carried away the fertile soil. "And you?" asked Elias, looking at her directly. "Do you also fight against it?" Clara held his gaze, aware of the weight of the question that went beyond land management. "I'm learning to work with it," she responded finally, "to understand that some erosions create new paths, new possibilities." A slight smile appeared on Elias's lips, one of those rare smiles that illuminated his eyes and softened the hardness of his features. "You're a wiser farmer than many I've known," he said with warmth. Clara felt a heat that ascended from her neck to her cheeks, not so much for the compliment as for the way he looked at her, as if he really saw her, not just her appearance or her circumstance, but something deeper and more essential. They continued working until the sun began to descend behind the distant mountains, tinting the sky with reddish and purplish tones. The system of furrows was almost finished, a network of channels that would catch rainwater and distribute it in a controlled manner, preventing it from accumulating where it could cause damage. While gathering the tools, Elias stopped suddenly. "There's something I want to show you," he said, with a tone that mixed determination and nervousness. "If you'll allow me." Clara nodded, intrigued. She followed him to the annex where he stayed, a space she had never entered out of respect for his privacy. It was a small but orderly room, with the bed carefully made and his few belongings arranged with military precision. Elias knelt beside his bed and extracted from underneath a worn wooden box, approximately the size of a large book. He placed it on the table and opened it with reverential care. "My brother Jacob gave it to me before we left for the war," he explained as he extracted an object wrapped in a discolored handkerchief. "I carved it for him when he turned 12, and he returned it to me, saying it would protect me." He unwrapped the handkerchief to reveal a wooden figure, an eagle with outstretched wings, carved with a mastery that surprised Clara. Each feather was detailed with precision, and the bird's eyes seemed to possess a living intensity despite being made of simple wood darkened by time. "It's beautiful," whispered Clara, resisting the impulse to touch it. "It didn't fulfill its purpose of protection, at least not for Jacob," continued Elias, his voice tinged with an ancient sadness, but no longer heartbreaking. "But I've kept it all these years. It's all I have left of him." The fact that he showed her something so personal, so intimately linked to his pain and his loss, did not escape Clara's understanding. It was an act of deep trust, a way of inviting her to know parts of himself that he kept carefully guarded. "May I?" she asked, extending a hand toward the figure. Elias nodded and handed her the carved eagle. Clara held it delicately, feeling the texture of the wood polished by years of being handled, perceiving the emotional weight of the object that went far beyond its physical mass. "You have a gift," she finally said, returning the carving. "Creating something like this from nothing. It's like magic." A shadow of a blush appeared on Elias's bronzed cheeks, a surprising contrast with his usual composure. "It's not magic," he responded with modesty. "Just patience and observation. The figure is already in the wood. I just remove what's extra." Clara smiled at the explanation. "Like erosion," she commented, revealing forms that were already there beneath the surface. Elias looked at her with a mixture of surprise and appreciation, as if she had articulated something that he himself had never considered. "Exactly like erosion," he agreed, carefully storing the eagle in its box. "I suppose we're both learning to see it with different eyes." That night, when Clara retired to her room, she carried with her the image of the carved eagle and the silent revelation that Elias had shared. As she brushed her hair in front of the cracked mirror, she wondered what hidden form might be revealed. By the gradual erosion of her own defenses, what figure would emerge when all the superfluous layers had been worn away by this new current that had entered her life? For the first time in years, the idea of change didn't frighten her. Erosion, after all, didn't just destroy. It also created new landscapes, new possibilities, new paths. Autumn announced itself with cold winds that descended from the mountains and nights that lengthened like shadows stretching at sunset. The harvest had been good, the barns were full, and the cabin had subtly transformed since Elias's arrival. New shelves now adorned the kitchen, built by his skilled hands to house the jars of preserves that Clara had prepared during the summer. The porch, previously a merely functional space, now had 2 rocking chairs that Elias had rescued from a pile of discarded wood, restoring them to their original dignity. The fireplace, clean and efficient thanks to his repairs, provided a warmth that seemed to extend beyond the physical. However, each night, Elias still retired to his annex by the tool shed, and Clara remained alone in the main cabin. A tacit agreement that neither had openly questioned, based on a mutual respect that sometimes seemed more like a barrier than a virtue. That night, the first autumn storm lashed the prairie, not with the electric fury of summer storms, but with a melancholic persistence, a fine but constant rain that pattered on the roof with a hypnotic rhythm. Clara, seated by the fire with a book in her lap, looked up when a distant thunder rumbled across the valley. She thought of Elias in his small annex, where the wind whistled through cracks that no repair could completely seal. The image of him, wrapped in blankets, trying to conserve heat in that reduced space, disturbed her in a way she couldn't ignore. She put the book aside and stood up, indecisive. She approached the window, observing how the rain drew liquid patterns on the glass. The lights of the annex were still on, a silhouette occasionally moving behind the fogged window. Clara breathed deeply and made a decision. She wrapped herself in a thick shawl and went out to the porch. The rain, though not torrential, soaked her in the few seconds it took to cover the distance to the annex. She knocked on the door with trembling knuckles, not just from the cold. Elias opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. His expression of surprise at seeing her there, with her hair and clothes soaked, quickly gave way to concern. "Clara." It was one of the few times he called her by her first name, without the formal Miss Whitmore. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head, drops of water detaching from her dark locks. "It's cold here," she said, the simple words but loaded with meaning. You shouldn't spend the winter in this place." Elias observed her in silence, his eyes searching in hers for some confirmation of what he thought he understood. "What do you suggest?" he finally asked, his voice hoarser than usual. Clara gathered all her courage, that same courage that had kept her alive and firm during the years of solitude. "The cabin is big for one person," she responded, holding his gaze. "Too big." A silence, loaded with possibilities, extended between them, interrupted only by the constant murmur of the rain on the roof. "Are you sure?" asked Elias with a seriousness that went beyond simple concern for propriety. "I don't want you to feel obligated." Clara let out a slight smile, moved by his concern. "If there's something you should know about me by now, Elias, Boone, it's that I don't do anything out of obligation." He nodded slowly, a smile barely insinuated at the corners of his lips. "Give me a moment to gather my things." There wasn't much to gather. His possessions fit in a canvas duffel bag and a wooden box where he kept his most precious objects, including the carved eagle. Clara waited under the eaves while he extinguished the lamp and closed the door of the annex for the last time. Together, they ran through the rain to the main cabin, a brief journey that somehow seemed to mark the end of a much longer journey. Once inside, the warmth of the fireplace enveloped them like a silent welcome. "You should change those wet clothes," suggested Elias, leaving his duffel bag by the door. Clara nodded and headed to her room. While changing, she heard Elias moving about the room, feeding the fire. His steps different from hers, but already familiar, already part of the rhythm of that house. When she returned, dressed in dry clothes and her hair brushed, she found him sitting before the fire, contemplating the flames with a thoughtful expression. He had left a cup of hot tea for her on the small table. "Thank you," said Clara, taking the cup and sitting in the rocking chair across from him. "It's curious," commented Elias after a moment, without taking his eyes from the fire. "When I arrived, here in the midst of that storm, I never imagined—" He interrupted himself as if searching for the right words. "What?" encouraged Clara. "That I would find a home," he completed, turning to look at her. "Not just a roof, but a true home." The word resonated in the space between them, loaded with meaning. Home was not a term that Clara had associated with the cabin since her father's death. It had been a refuge, a fortress, a duty. But not a home. Not until now. I didn't imagine it either, she admitted in a low voice, that it could be one again. Their gazes met, and in that silent exchange there was more intimacy than in any physical contact they had shared. It was the mutual recognition of two souls that had found in the other something they didn't even know they were looking for. That night, Clara showed him the small free room at the end of the hallway, originally intended for a brother who was never born. There was a narrow bed, a chest for clothes, and a window that faced east where the morning sun would enter. "It's not much," she apologized. "It's more than I've had in years," responded Elias with sincerity. They said good night with a brief kiss, chaste but loaded with promise, before each retiring to their room. The arrangement was as new as the sensation of having another heart beating under the same roof. Both needed time to adjust to this new shared reality. That night, while the rain continued its litany on the roof, Clara fell asleep with the certainty that the cabin had ceased to be a simple refuge against the outside world. It had become, almost without her noticing, the stage for something that much resembled happiness, a home. Not built on the foundations of the past, but patiently carved, like the figures that emerged from blocks of wood under Elias's skilled hands. A new creation, unexpected and nevertheless somehow inevitable, like the furrows that water draws on the earth after the storm. The invitation came in the form of a poster they saw nailed to the bulletin board of the general store during their monthly visit to town to stock up. Grand Autumn Ball at the Community Barn. Saturday, October 15th, live music. Please bring something to share. Clara barely gave it a glance, accustomed to ignoring this type of social event that only served to remind her of her outsider status. But Elias stopped in front of the announcement, studying it with interest. "We could go," he suggested, as they loaded the supplies into the cart. Clara looked at him with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "To a ball?" Her tone made clear how absurd the idea seemed to her. "The people in town barely speak to me, and they look at you with distrust because of your Confederate past." Elias finished securing a sack of flour before responding. "Precisely because of that," he said calmly. "It's time they stop seeing us as outsiders or threats, that they see us as we really are." "And how are we?" asked Clara, genuinely curious about how he perceived them. "People who are building something good," responded Elias, his gaze clear and direct. "Something that deserves to be recognized, not hidden." Clara remained silent during the return journey, weighing his words. She had spent so much time defining herself through isolation, building her identity in opposition to the town and its inhabitants, that the idea of seeking some kind of acceptance or integration seemed almost transgressive to her. That night, seated on the porch with cups of hot coffee, she resumed the conversation. "I don't have anything appropriate for a ball," she said, like someone offering an excuse but secretly seeking to be convinced. Elias smiled, recognizing the opening she was giving him. "In the chest in my room, there's something that might be useful," he responded. "A gift I've been saving for a special occasion." Clara looked at him with surprise. She didn't know that he had bought something for her, much less that he kept it secret. The next day, while Elias worked in the stable, Clara yielded to curiosity. She entered his room, a space that he had kept as orderly and austere as his personality, and opened the wooden chest with certain apprehension, as if she were invading sacred territory. Under some carefully folded garments, she found a package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple cord. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers to reveal a fine wool shawl, dyed in a deep blue that recalled the night sky. It was a beautiful garment in its simplicity, with a discreet embroidery of small silver stars at the ends. Clara held it against the light that entered through the window, marveling at the softness of the fabric. It wasn't an ostentatious garment like those worn by the merchants' wives in town, but it had a subtle elegance that resonated with her. When Elias returned for lunch, he found the shawl carefully folded on the table with a simple note: "We'll go to the ball." The days prior to the event passed in a state of nervous anticipation. Clara unnecessarily unearthed from the bottom of her wardrobe the only dress she kept from her previous life, a simple dark blue dress that had belonged to her mother and that she had never had occasion to wear. She washed it and mended where time had left its mark, adding some details with threads that matched the shawl. Saturday arrived with a clear sky and a cool air that announced the approaching winter. Clara took more time than usual to prepare, gathering her hair in a more elaborate bun than her usual practical braid, even allowing herself a touch of color on her lips with the berry juice that her mother had taught her to use. When she came out of her room, she found Elias waiting in the living room. He had completely shaved, revealing the entirety of the scar on his cheek that the beard normally partially hid. His dark hair, usually unkempt, was combed back, and he wore a clean shirt and a vest that Clara hadn't seen before. "You're beautiful," he said in a soft voice, his eyes reflecting an admiration that made Clara feel a warmth rising to her cheeks. "You also look different," she responded, unsure of how to express what she felt seeing him like this, transformed but recognizable, like a more polished version of himself. Elias smiled, unconsciously touching his exposed scar. "Too visible?" he asked, referring to the mark. Clara shook her head, approaching to lightly touch the white line with the tip of her fingers. "It's part of you," she said simply. "As you said, better to show our scars than try to hide them." The journey to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached, the sound of violins and accordions became more audible, mixing with the murmur of conversations and laughter that emanated from the community barn. Clara felt her resolution falter upon seeing the number of people gathered. Entire families, couples, young people from town that she barely recognized after years of voluntary isolation. Elias, perceiving her unease, took her hand and squeezed it gently. "We're together in this," he murmured, just for her ears. "And we can leave whenever you want." Their presence caused exactly the effect that Clara had feared. A momentary silence, curious looks, and barely disguised whispers. But Elias, with a dignity that seemed impermeable to others' scrutiny, calmly guided her to a table where they left the apple pie they had brought to share. Martha Pearson, the storekeeper's wife, approached them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clara Whitmore, what a surprise to see you here," she commented, her gaze evaluating the dress and the shawl. "It's been years since you last attended a community event." "Good evening, Mrs. Pearson," responded Clara with all the courtesy she could gather. "Yes, it's been a long time." "And I see you come accompanied," continued the woman, directing her attention to Elias. "Mr. Boone, isn't it? Miss Whitmore's temporary guest." The way she pronounced temporary guest made it clear that rumors about their situation had circulated widely, adorned with unfavorable speculations. "Good evening, Mrs. Pearson," greeted Elias with a polite inclination of his head. "I'm afraid I'm not as temporary as it might seem. Clara and I are building a life together." The declaration, direct and without ambiguities, momentarily left the woman speechless. Clara felt a mixture of astonishment and gratitude at the way Elias had established their relationship, not as something to be ashamed of or that needed explanation, but as a simple and dignified fact. "I see," finally responded Martha, composing herself. "Well, welcome then. Enjoy the evening." She walked away with the stiffness of someone who has received an answer they didn't expect and doesn't know how to process. Clara looked at Elias, a genuine smile illuminating her face. "Building a life together," she repeated in a low voice. "It sounds good when you say it like that." "It's the truth, isn't it?" he responded, his expression serious, but with a gleam in his eyes that Clara had learned to recognize as contained happiness. The music changed to a slower rhythm, and Elias extended his hand toward her in a silent invitation. Clara hesitated only an instant before accepting it, allowing him to guide her toward the center of the barn, where other couples were already moving to the beat of the melody. "I haven't danced since I was a child," she confessed, suddenly conscious of every muscle in her body. "I don't remember the last time either," admitted Elias. "I suppose we can relearn together." He placed a hand respectfully on her waist, keeping the other interlaced with hers. Clara rested her free hand on his shoulder, surprised by how natural that contact felt. They began to move with uncertain steps that gradually found a shared rhythm. It wasn't an elegant dance like that, executed by some of the couples around them, but it had a sincerity that compensated for any lack of technique. Clara, was acutely aware of the gazes they attracted, but for the first time in years, she didn't care about others' judgment. There was something liberating in being there, moving to the beat of the music in the arms of a man who looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. "They're talking about us," she murmured, having caught fragments of conversations. "Around them. Let them talk," responded Elias, his voice a low rumble just for her. "What we have is ours, not theirs to judge." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture of trust that caused more than one whisper to rise among the observers. But in that moment, wrapped in Elias's familiar scent, with the starry shawl on her shoulders and the music enveloping them, like a protective bubble, Clara Whitmore felt truly free for the first time in years. It wasn't the freedom of isolation, of the solitary fortress she had built around her life. It was the freedom of being seen and accepted, of showing her true self without apologies or explanations, the freedom to dance under the gazes of those who had once judged her, with her head high and her heart open. When the music ended, they returned to their table amid courteous applause. Some people began to approach, first with caution, then with growing warmth. Old Peterson, whose farm bordered Clara's to the west, offered them freshly pressed cider. The town teacher, a young woman recently arrived who didn't carry the prejudices of the older inhabitants, sat with them and conversed animatedly about books. Little by little, the invisible wall that had separated Clara from the community began to show cracks, not through unanimous or immediate acceptance, but through the simple act of presenting themselves as who they really were, two people who had found in each other a reason to move forward. At the end of the night, when they returned, home under a mantle of stars that seemed to reflect the silver embroidery of the shawl, Clara felt transformed, not by social approval, which remained fragile and partial, but by having found the courage to show herself vulnerable to a world that had once hurt her. "Thank you," she said, breaking the comfortable silence of the road. "For what?" asked Elias, gently guiding the horses through the dark path. "For helping me remember that there's more to life than simply surviving." Elias took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence that made Clara's heart expand in her chest. "That's what we do for each other," he responded with simplicity. "Remind each other that living is more than breathing." That night, for the first time, Clara did not go to her solitary room. In the intimacy of the cabin that was now truly a shared home, two souls marked by loss and solitude found mutual comfort, not only in physical passion, but in the deep certainty of having found, against all odds, a place where both belonged. Not in a geographical space, but in each other's arms. Winter arrived with its white mantle, transforming the prairies into a landscape of crystalline stillness. The cabin, isolated under the snow that accumulated on the paths, became a self-sufficient universe for Clara and Elias. The days shortened, the nights lengthened, and the intimacy they had discovered flourished in the forced seclusion of the season. They no longer slept in separate rooms. Clara's bed, previously a symbol of her solitude, now welcomed two bodies, two breaths that synchronized in the darkness. Mornings began with the ritual of lighting the fire, while the other prepared breakfast, a domestic dance they had perfected without need for words. It was during one of those tranquil mornings, with the snow falling silently behind the windows, when Clara noticed the first change in her body, a sensation of lightness in her head when rising too quickly, a sudden dislike for the smell of coffee she had previously so enjoyed. At first, she attributed these symptoms to winter confinement, to the lack of fresh air and exercise, but as the days passed and her body continued sending her signals, she began to recognize what they truly meant. One afternoon, while Elias worked in the stable, repairing harnesses and preparing tools for the spring that seemed so distant, Clara sat in the rocking chair by the fire and placed a hand on her still flat belly. There was no doubt a new life had begun to gestate within her. The revelation filled her with contradictory emotions. Joy, of course, but also an ancestral fear that all women in her situation have felt since the beginning of time. Fear of childbirth, of complications, of the fragility of life in those harsh lands where medical assistance was scarce and rudimentary. But above all, she felt a strange and powerful connection to the past and future simultaneously, with her mother, whom she barely remembered but whose love she could now understand from a new perspective. With the generations of women who had carried life in their wombs amid the vastness of those prairies, she didn't tell Elias immediately. She kept the secret for days, savoring it in solitude, adapting to the idea that her body no longer belonged solely to her. She observed Elias when he didn't notice, imagining how he would react to the news, wondering if she would see in his eyes the same fear she felt, or if joy would predominate. One morning, while they breakfasted in the company of the crackling fire, Elias surprised her by sliding across the table a small carved object, a tiny horse, no larger than her thumb, sculpted with the same mastery as the eagle he kept as a treasure. "For you," he said simply, "or for whoever is on the way." Clara looked up, surprised and moved in equal parts. "How did you know?" she asked, taking the small figure between her fingers. Elias smiled, one of those rare smiles that completely transformed his usually serious face. "I know you," he responded with simplicity. "I know how you move, how you breathe. Everything about you has subtly changed in the last few weeks, and besides," he added with a playful gleam in his eyes, "you've been rejecting the coffee you—" "So enjoy," Clara laughed, a laugh that released part of the tension she had been accumulating. "And you didn't say anything?" "I was waiting for you to want to share it," he explained. "Some news needs time to be pronounced." Clara studied the small horse in her palm, marveled by the details, the tiny mane, the proud posture, the eyes that seemed to look toward a distant horizon. "I'm afraid," she finally confessed, allowing herself to express the vulnerability she had been containing. "This place is harsh for raising a child. Far from everything, from the doctor, from—" Elias extended his hand across the table, covering hers with his comforting warmth. "You won't be alone," he said with a firmness that dissipated some of her concerns. "You'll never be alone again, Clara. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." That promise, simple but profound, became the anchor to which Clara clung during the following months. As her body changed, Elias adapted life in the cabin to facilitate her comfort. He built a cradle with light woods, carving in the headboard the same star motif that adorned the blue shawl. He expanded the cabin with a small additional room, working tirelessly during the days when the weather permitted. Spring arrived, bringing with it the thaw and an explosion of renewed life in the prairies. Clara, with her belly now visibly rounded, spent hours on the porch, feeling the movements of the creature inside her, while observing how nature awakened from its winter lethargy. It was during one of those spring days when they decided to visit the grove of wild plum trees again. The place where they had shared their first kiss had become a kind of private sanctuary for both, a space where Clara's memories of her father and Elias's of his brother seemed to coexist in peaceful harmony. The trees were in full bloom, their branches covered with small white flowers that perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance. Clara, walking with the new cadence that her pregnancy imposed, stopped under the largest of the plum trees, the one where her father had taught her to climb. "Do you think it will be a boy or a girl?" she asked, resting both hands on her belly. Elias, who had spread a blanket on the grass so she could sit comfortably, looked at her with tenderness. "It doesn't matter," he responded. "What matters is that he or she will be strong like their mother and stubborn like their father." Clara smiled, recognizing in that description a fundamental truth about both of them. "We should think about names," she suggested, settling on the blanket with Elias's help. He sat beside her, leaning on an elbow to better observe her. "Your father was named Samuel, right?" Clara nodded, moved by the implicit gesture in his question. "Samuel is a good name," continued Elias. "Or perhaps James, like my grandfather. The only one in my family who understood why I preferred carving wood to hunting." "James," repeated Clara, savoring the sound. "I like it. James Whitmore Boone. Sounds like the name of someone who will do great things," commented Elias, a smile softening his features. "Or maybe just good things," added Clara. "He doesn't need to be great. He just needs to be happy." They remained under the plum trees until the sun began to descend, talking about the future, about plans, about hopes, not with the arrogant certainty of those who have never faced loss, but with the cautious hope of those who have learned that happiness is fragile but possible. That night, back at the cabin, Clara extracted from her sewing basket a project she had been working on in secret. A small quilt made with scraps of Elias's old shirts, too worn to be mended but too loaded with history to be discarded. "For the baby," she explained, showing him the work in progress. "So he always feels wrapped in your strength." Elias touched the fabric with reverent fingers, recognizing fragments of garments that had accompanied significant moments in their joint life. The shirt he wore the day of the storm when they met, the one he wore to the ball in the barn, the one he used while building the irrigation system that had saved their crops. "It's perfect," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "like everything you do." That night, while Elias slept deeply beside her, Clara remained awake, contemplating the wooden ceiling in the penumbra. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the occasional movements of the baby, like messages in code from a world she would soon give way to. She thought about the changes she had experienced in recent years, from daughter to orphan, from solitary woman to companion, and now the deepest change of all, from woman to mother. Each transformation had come unexpectedly, altering the course of her existence as water alters the landscape, eroding certainties, creating new channels. And yet, for the first time in her life, Clara didn't fear change. She embraced it, accepted it as a natural part of the flow of existence, because now she knew that she didn't have to face it alone, that some erosions, as she had said months ago, don't destroy, but create new paths, new possibilities. With that comforting thought, she finally let herself be carried away by sleep, her body and that of the unborn child protected by Elias's unconscious embrace, whose arm rested protectively over her waist, even in dreams fulfilling the promise of never leaving her alone again. Summer was at its peak when the pains began. Clara was in the garden picking tomatoes for preserves when the first contraction doubled her over, forcing her to drop the basket she carried in her hands. The red fruits rolled over the damp earth like drops of blood, an image that would remain etched in her memory in the days that followed. Elias, who was repairing a nearby fence, came running at her call. Without wasting time on unnecessary questions, he carried her in his arms to the cabin, placing her with delicacy on the bed they had prepared weeks before, following the instructions of the town midwife, who had promised to come when the time arrived. "I'll go find Mrs. Wilson," said Elias, referring to the experienced midwife. "Hold on, I'll return as soon as possible." Clara nodded, unable to speak, while another contraction traveled through her body like a wave of fire. Elias kissed her sweaty forehead before hurriedly leaving. The hours that followed merged into a continuum of pain and waiting. The sun reached its zenith and began to descend, painting the walls of the room with golden tones that contrasted with the intensity of the experience Clara was living. When she finally heard the sound of hooves approaching, the relief almost made her cry. But it was only Elias who entered the room, his face tense with concern. "Mrs. Wilson is attending another birth at the other end of the valley," he explained, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand. "Her daughter says she'll come as soon as she can, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both knew what it meant. The baby wouldn't wait. "Then it's you and me," said Clara, with a calmness that surprised them both. "As it's always been." Elias looked at her with a mixture of admiration and terror, aware of the responsibility that had just fallen on his shoulders. "I've never—" he began, the doubt evident in his voice. "Neither have I," she interrupted, squeezing his hand forcefully while another contraction crossed her. "But my mother gave birth to 6 children, 4 of them without help. It's in my blood. And you have the most skilled hands I've known." It was true. The hands that carved figures from wood, that tamed frightened animals, that built and repaired with precision, were hands in which she completely trusted. The following hours were a joint battle, a coordinated effort between two people who had learned to communicate beyond words. Elias followed Clara's broken instructions, remembering fragments of knowledge he had acquired during the war, when he had occasionally assisted field doctors in the birth of children of displaced women. The sun had completely set when the newborn's sharp cry broke the silence of the cabin, a cry of life, of triumph over darkness. "It's a boy," announced Elias, his voice broken with emotion as he held the tiny, bloodied and wrinkled being. a strong and healthy boy, with precise but trembling movements. He cut the umbilical cord and wrapped the baby in the quilt that Clara had made with scraps of his shirts. When he placed the child on Clara's chest, something changed in the universe, an imperceptible but fundamental shift, as if a new star had appeared in the firmament. "James," whispered Clara, touching with delicate fingers the tiny cheek. "James Whitmore Boone, welcome to the world." Elias sat on the edge of the bed, observing mother and son with an expression that mixed incredulity, admiration, and a love so deep that it seemed to alter his features, softening the hard lines that life had carved in his face. "Thank you," he said simply, leaning to kiss Clara's forehead. "For what?" she asked, without taking her eyes from her son's face. "For this," he responded, encompassing the three with a gesture. "For making me part of something I never thought I deserved." Mrs. Wilson arrived at dawn, finding the new family asleep in a protective embrace. She checked with professional efficiency that both mother and baby were well, commenting with approval on the work that Elias had performed in such difficult circumstances. The days that followed passed in the characteristic haze of new parents, interrupted nights, constant learning, moments of wonder and absolute terror. Jamie, as they soon began to call him, turned out to be a baby of calm temperament, but with surprisingly powerful lungs when something displeased him. One afternoon, while Clara nursed the little one on the porch, enjoying the fresh air after days of seclusion, she noticed that Elias was working on something near the large oak that dominated the yard. So curious, he seemed to be planting something. When Jamie finished feeding and fell asleep in her arms, Clara cautiously approached to see what he was doing. Elias was kneeling beside a small sapling, barely a stem with some leaves that he had just planted and was watering with care. "What is it?" she asked, adjusting the sleeping baby against her shoulder. Elias stood up, cleaning the dirt from his hands onto his pants. "A plum tree," he responded. "From seeds from the grove. I thought it would be good to have one here close to the house. For Jamie." Clara immediately understood the symbolism of the gesture. It wasn't just a tree, it was a legacy, a connection between the past and the future, between the place where they had begun their love story and the home where they now raised their son. "It's perfect," she said, leaning against him while both contemplated the fragile sapling. "It will grow with him." "That's the idea," confirmed Elias, surrounding Clara's shoulders with an arm, creating a protective circle around her and the baby. "A root to remind him where he comes from, and branches to show him how far he can go." Clara thought about all the storms that little sapling would have to endure, relentless winds, frosts, droughts, just as her son would face his own challenges in a world that could sometimes be as beautiful as it was cruel. "It will need care," she commented, referring to both the tree and the child. "It will have it," assured Elias with the quiet certainty that was so characteristic of him, all that we can give. That night, after putting Jamie to bed in the cradle that Elias had carved with such love, Clara found her companion sitting on the porch, contemplating the stars with a thoughtful expression. She sat beside him in silence, enjoying the cool night air and the peace that only comes after a baby finally falls asleep. "What are you thinking about?" she finally asked, noting the intensity of his gaze lost in the firmament. Elias took a moment to respond, as if he were organizing thoughts that had been gestating for a long time. "About how everything changes," he said at last. 3 years. Day ago I was lost, wandering without purpose, carrying guilt that wasn't mine. And now he made a gesture toward the cabin, toward the window behind which their son slept. "Now I have roots," he completed, "and branches that extend toward the future." Clara took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Are you happy?" she asked, the question simple but loaded with meaning. Elias turned to her, his eyes reflecting the silver light of the moon. "What do you think?" he responded with another question, a slight smile curving his lips. "I think you are," said Clara, "but I like to hear it." Elias squeezed her hand gently. "I'm happier than I thought possible," he confessed. "More than I think I deserve." "Merit has nothing to do with happiness," reflected Clara. "It arrives when it arrives, like the rain or the sun. The important thing is to recognize it when it appears and not drive it away with doubts." Elias looked at her with that expression that always made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. "When did you become so wise?" asked Elias, with a smile that illuminated his eyes. "It's not wisdom," responded Clara, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's survival. You learn to value the good when you've known the bad." The soft crying of Jamie interrupted their conversation, a reminder of the new life that now dictated the rhythm of their days and nights. "I'll go," said Elias, standing up with a fluid movement. Clara observed him as he entered the cabin, marveled by how this tall man, marked by war, transformed completely when approaching his son's cradle. His movements, always precise, acquired a special delicacy when he lifted the little one, as if he were handling the most fragile of crystals. Through the open window, she heard the murmur of his deep voice, singing a lullaby that Clara didn't recognize, probably a melody from his own distant childhood. The contrast between the hard man who had arrived at her door in the midst of a storm and this tender father who cradled his son was a constant reminder of how much both had changed. When the crying ceased, Clara looked back at the stars, thinking about all the lives that had intertwined to reach this moment. Her parents, Elias's lost brother, and now Jamie, a new thread in the fabric of their existences. She smiled to herself, a full smile that no one saw, but that reflected a deep certainty. They had built something good here, something that would endure, like the newly planted plum tree, the inevitable storms to come. Autumn returned to tint the prairies in copper and golden tones. Jamie had turned 3 months old, and his small face was beginning to show expressions that went beyond simple crying or basic satisfaction. Clara discovered new gestures each day, new gazes that fascinated her and kept her in a constant state of wonder. The routine had reorganized around the baby, with Elias assuming more farm tasks, while Clara recovered from childbirth and attended to the little one. But gradually she had returned to participating in the daily work, carrying Jamie with her in an improvised bundle that allowed her to keep him close while she harvested or fed the animals. That morning in late October, Clara was in the kitchen, preparing preserves for winter, when Elias entered with a worried expression. "There's a rider approaching," he announced, his tense posture reminding Clara of the early days, when distrust was his natural state. Clara put down the knife with which she was cutting apples and approached the window. Indeed, a solitary figure on horseback was advancing along the main path, still too far to distinguish his features. "Do you recognize the horse?" she asked, trying to identify the visitor. Elias shook his head. "It's no one from the town." The protective instinct immediately activated in both. Clara went to the cradle where Jamie slept and took him in her arms, gently waking him. The baby protested with a sleepy moan. "I'll take him to the back room," decided Clara. "You go receive the visitor." No more needed to be said. In the years of cohabitation, they had developed an almost telepathic communication, especially in situations of potential danger. Clara knew that Elias would take the rifle, not as a threat but as a precaution, and that he would keep the stranger away from the house until determining his intentions. From the window of the back room, while rocking Jamie to calm him, Clara observed the meeting. The rider stopped his horse at a prudent distance from where Elias waited, standing firm on the porch. He was an older man, with completely white hair and a hunched posture on the mount. Even at that distance, something about him seemed vaguely familiar. After a brief exchange that she couldn't hear, she saw how Elias's posture radically changed. His body, previously tense and prepared for any threat, seemed to deflate as if he had received an invisible blow. The rifle, which he had discreetly kept at his side, was deposited against the wall of the cabin. Intrigued and concerned in equal parts, Clara headed to the front door, still with Jamie in her arms. "Thanks." And she went out to the porch. Elias turned to her with an expression she couldn't interpret, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something resembling fear. "Clara," he said with an unusually trembling voice, "this is Thomas Boone, my father." The older man dismounted with the difficulty proper to his years and removed his hat in a gesture of respect toward Clara. His eyes, the same intense blue as Elias's, settled on the baby with evident emotion. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted with a grave voice. "I apologize for presenting myself without prior notice. I've traveled a long way to find my son." Clara looked alternately at Elias and the newcomer, processing the information. Elias had never mentioned that his father was alive. In fact, he always spoke of him in the past tense as if he had died years ago, perhaps during the war. "Mr. Boone," she finally responded, adjusting Jamie in her arms. "Welcome to our home." The old man nodded in gratitude, but his eyes remained fixed on his son as if he feared he might disappear if he looked away. "It's been 8 years, Elias," he said, with a voice loaded with emotion. 8 years without knowing if you were alive or dead." Elias remained rigid, his emotions carefully contained behind a mask of formality. "I could say the same," he finally responded. "The farm." "It was lost," interrupted the old man. "Shortly after you and Jacob left, the Unionists burned it, believing it harbored Confederate sympathizers." A heavy silence followed this revelation. Clara, aware of the emotional storm Elias must be experiencing, stepped forward. "You must be tired after such a long journey, Mr. Boone," she intervened softly. "Please, come in and rest. We have hot food and a bed to offer you." Thomas Boone inclined his head again in gratitude, and after a moment of hesitation, Elias stepped aside to allow him to enter the cabin. The contrast between the hunched old man and his son, still in the fullness of his strength, was painfully evident as they crossed the threshold. The meal took place in an uncomfortable silence, barely interrupted by practical questions about the journey or comments about the weather. Thomas explained briefly that he had survived working as an itinerant blacksmith, moving from town to town in the Northern Territories. Only recently had he obtained information about his son's possible whereabouts, thanks to a fur trader who had mentioned a boon established in the Montana prairies with a woman named Whitmore. "I couldn't die without knowing," said the old man, his gaze alternating between Elias and the baby, who now slept peacefully in Clara's arms. "Without meeting my grandson." The word grandson seemed to open a crack in Elias's emotional armor. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and Clara could see a flash of the vulnerability he so carefully hid from the world, but never from her. "His name is James," said Elias, his voice softer. "James Whitmore Boone, but we call him Jamie." A trembling smile appeared on the weathered face of the old man. "James, like your grandfather." Elias nodded, and in that simple gesture, Clara saw the recognition of a continuity, of an invisible thread that united the generations, despite separations and conflicts. "May I?" asked Thomas, extending his arms with timidity toward the baby. Clara looked at Elias, seeking his approval. After a moment of doubt, he nodded almost imperceptibly. Carefully, Clara deposited Jamie in the trembling but secure arms of the old man. Thomas Boone contemplated his grandson with an expression that mixed amazement and pain, as if in that small face he saw reflected all the lost years, all the postponed reconciliations. "He has your eyes, Elias," he murmured. "Your mother's eyes." The mention of his mother, who died when Elias was barely a teenager, seemed to crumble the last barriers. Elias abruptly stood up and left the cabin without a word, the door closing with more force than necessary behind him. Clara and Thomas exchanged a look of understanding. "Give him time," said the old man, carefully returning the baby to Clara's arms. "He was always like that, even as a child. He needed to digest things in his own way, in solitude." Clara nodded, recognizing in that description the man she loved. "How did you really find him?" she asked, knowing there was more to the story than the old man had shared. Thomas Boone sighed, rubbing his gnarled hands in a gesture that Clara had seen 1,000 times in his son. "I never stopped looking for him," he confessed. "All these years, in every town, in every trading post, I asked about a man named Elias Boone, with a scar on his left cheek. Most of the time I got no answer. Sometimes I would get a rumor, a direction that turned out to be false." He paused, his eyes losing themselves in painful memories. "Guilt has accompanied me every day since I saw them leave for the war," he continued. "The last words I said to him were harsh, full of anger. I told him he was making the same mistake I had, dragging his brother into a lost cause." His voice broke. I didn't learn of Jacob's death until 2 years later. Clara felt a deep compassion for this man, broken by years and remorse. She then understood why Elias never spoke of his father as someone alive. He had emotionally buried him along with his brother, along with his past. "You've traveled a long way to find forgiveness," she said softly. The old man shook his head. "I didn't come seeking forgiveness," he responded. "I came to offer it. I should have supported my sons, even if I didn't share their decision. A father doesn't abandon his children, regardless of the circumstances." Clara thought of her own father, of how he had taught her to fend for herself without ever ceasing to support her, of how he would have reacted to Elias, to Jamie. Nostalgia hit her with unexpected force. "Elias will listen to you," she assured, though she wasn't completely convinced. "He just needs time." That night, after accommodating Thomas in the guest room, Clara found Elias sitting under the small plum tree he had planted for Jamie. The moon illuminated his tense profile, highlighting the scar on his cheek like a silver line. She sat beside him in silence, respecting his need to process what had happened. Finally, it was he who broke the silence. "I thought he was dead," he said with a hoarse voice. "All these years, I imagined that the war had taken him like Jacob. It was easier that way." "Easier than forgiving?" asked Clara softly. Elias looked at her, his eyes bright in the darkness. "Easier than facing my own guilt," he corrected. "For taking Jacob and me to a war that he knew we couldn't win. For not being there when we lost the farm. For abandoning him." Clara took his hand, feeling under her fingers the calluses formed by years of hard work. "You've built your life from those losses," she said. "They've formed you, made you who you are. The man I love, the father of my son." Elias squeezed her hand, silently thanking her for her understanding. "I don't know if I can completely forgive," he confessed. "There's too much buried pain." "You don't have to decide tonight," responded Clara. "Forgiveness, like everything important, takes time. Like this tree," she added, pointing to the small plum tree. "It won't grow overnight." Elias nodded, finding wisdom in the simple analogy. He stood and extended his hand to help her. "Let's go to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be another day." And as they walked back to the cabin, Clara felt that something fundamental had changed, as if a long-closed door had been left ajar, allowing a ray of light to illuminate dark corners that Elias had kept in shadows, even from her. Thomas Boone's unexpected visit, far from being a threat as they had initially feared, could become an opportunity to heal old wounds, to build bridges over abysses of silence and resentment, to complete the circle of a family that, like the small plum tree, was just beginning to take root. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas Boone remained with them. What had begun as a brief visit extended without anyone mentioning deadlines or farewells. The old man had silently integrated into the routine of the cabin, finding small ways to make himself useful, repairing tools with the skill of the blacksmith he had been, telling stories by the fire during the long winter nights, or simply holding Jamie for hours, contemplating him as if in that small face he could read all the secrets of the universe. The relationship between father and son evolved slowly, like a glacier that recedes millimeter by millimeter, gradually revealing a landscape long hidden beneath the ice. There had been no great conversations or dramatic reconciliations, but small moments of reconnection, a shared comment about the weather, advice sought on repairing a plough, a question about blacksmithing techniques remembered from childhood. Clara observed this cautious dance with patience, recognizing in both men the same reticence to express emotions openly, the same stubborn pride that preferred to drown pain rather than show it. So similar despite the years of separation, the stored resentments, the divergent paths. One afternoon in early December, while Clara knitted by the fire and Jamie slept in his cradle, she heard the voices of Elias and Thomas coming from the shed. Curiosity led her to peek out the window, from where she could see them working together on something she can't clearly distinguish. Both heads, one dark and one silver, bent over an object, their hands moving in a coordination that spoke of a shared muscle memory, of teachings transmitted from father to son long ago. They didn't seem to talk much, but it wasn't a tense silence like in the early days. It was the comfortable silence of those who don't need words to understand each other. That night, while they ate the stew that Thomas had prepared, surprising Clara with the culinary skill he had developed in his years of itinerant life. Elias spoke more than usual, relating anecdotes from his childhood that Clara had never heard. Stories about how his father had taught him to recognize the right metal for each tool, how he had shown him to keep the forge fire alive even on the dampest days. Thomas listened with a melancholy smile, occasionally correcting some detail or adding some forgotten element. It was as if both were reconstructing together a bridge that time and war had destroyed, placing each memory like a stone on the foundations of their fractured relationship. Christmas was approaching, the first that Jamie would experience. Though he was too young to remember it, Clara, inspired by the atmosphere of renewal she felt in the home, decided they should celebrate it properly, something she hadn't done since her father's death. The three adults threw themselves into the preparations, with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Elias and Thomas went out together to look for a small pine to place in a corner of the living room, while Clara baked cookies, following a recipe she vaguely remembered from her childhood. Christmas Eve morning, Clara woke up early to find the house empty, except for Jamie, who slept peacefully in his cradle. Puzzled, she went out to the porch where the cold hit her like a slap. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the landscape with an immaculate mantle that shone under the first rays of the sun. Following the footprints in the snow, she reached the shed where Elias and Thomas had been secretly working for days. The door was ajar, and inside she found the two men asleep in uncomfortable positions, as if they had worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Between them, on an improvised table, rested the project they had been collaborating on, a music box carved in cedar wood, with intricate designs of leaves and animals that Clara recognized as Elias's work, and delicate metal mechanisms that could only be the fruit of Thomas's skill as a blacksmith. The noise of her steps woke Elias, who sat up with a start, momentarily disoriented. Upon seeing Clara, a sleepy smile appeared on his face. "It was supposed to be a surprise," he said, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. "It is," she responded, approaching to examine the box. "It's beautiful." Thomas also woke up, emitting a grunt as he stretched his hunched back. "The mechanism still needs adjustments," he commented, with the pride of a craftsman who knows the value of his work. "But it will be ready for tonight." Clara observed them, this father and son who had found in shared work a language to express what words could not. She then understood that forgiveness didn't always come in grand declarations or dramatic moments. Sometimes it was built slowly, through small but significant actions, complicit silences, shared projects. That night, gathered around the small pine decorated with simple paper ornaments and bits of fabric, they exchanged the few gifts they had been able to prepare. A knitted shawl by Clara for Thomas, a carved pipe by Elias for his father, and for Clara, the music box that finally worked to perfection. When she turned the small handle, a soft melody filled the room. "Amazing Grace," the song that Elias sometimes hummed while working, without being aware of it. The three remained silent, listening to the delicate notes that seemed to float in the warm air of the cabin, each lost in their own thoughts, but united by something stronger than blood or duty, the will to heal, to forgive, to build something new on the ashes of the past. Jamie, awake in Clara's arms, emitted a gurgle of joy, as if he understood the importance of the moment. Thomas approached and, with a timidity improper to his usually direct character, extended his arms toward the baby. Clara gave him without hesitation, fully trusting those elderly but firm hands. "I've made something for him too," said Thomas, while Elias stood up to fetch something from his room. He returned with a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Upon unwrapping it, Clara saw a silver rattle, simple but beautifully crafted, with Jamie's name engraved in tiny but perfect letters. "It was Elias's when he was a baby," explained Thomas. "I kept it all these years. It was the only thing that remained of the house after the fire." The revelation left Clara speechless. That object, saved from the flames and transported for years by a man who wandered from town to town, was more than a simple toy. It was a symbol of hope, of the unshakable belief that someday he would find his son, that the family could reunite again. Elias contemplated the rattle with an indecipherable expression, as if that small silver object had opened a gateway to memories he thought forever lost. "I remember it," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I remember the sound it made when I shook it, how it shone under the sun when Mother cleaned it." His eyes met his father's, and in that gaze there was no trace of the resentment or distrust that had marked their first reunions. Only a deep understanding, a recognition of shared pain and the mutual will to transcend it. "Thank you," he said simply, "for keeping it, for finding us." Thomas nodded, unable to speak, his eyes bright with contained tears. Without need for words, he extended his hand toward his son. Elias took it, and for a moment the three Boones formed a complete circle, the grandfather holding the grandson, the father connecting the generations, the baby oblivious to the deep meaning of the moment, but feeling the warmth of the love that surrounded him. Clara observed the scene, her heart overflowing with an emotion that went beyond simple happiness. It was the certainty that, despite all the losses, all the tortuous and painful paths they had traveled to get here, they were exactly where they should be. The music box continued softly playing its melody of redemption. The fire crackled in the fireplace and outside. The stars shone over the snowy prairie with the crystalline clarity that only winter nights can offer. That night, while everyone slept, Clara rose silently and approached the window. The moon illuminated the small plum tree planted for Jamie, now covered in snow but still firm, patiently waiting for spring to grow a little more. She thought of her own father, of how he would have enjoyed this moment, this home that she had built from the teachings he had left her. She thought of the mother she barely remembered, but whose love she still felt like a warm presence in the darkest moments, and she knew with a certainty that warmed her soul, despite the cold of the glass against her forehead, that broken circles could be repaired, that fallen bridges could be rebuilt, that the deepest wounds could heal if given the necessary time and care. Like the small plum tree beneath the snow, like the melody that emerged note by note from the music box, carved by hands that had learned to work together again, like the love that had blossomed in the most unexpected place. A solitary cabin in the prairies of Montana, where once there had only been silence, and now resonated the interwoven voices of a reunited family. Spring arrived with its explosion of renewed life. The fields covered themselves with wildflowers, birds returned from their winter migrations, and the small plum tree planted for Jamie began to show its first green shoots, timid but resilient. Thomas Boone had decided to stay. There was no great conversation about it. The possibility of his departure simply ceased to be mentioned. During the winter, he and Elias had built a small blacksmith shop next to the shed, where the old man could practice the trade that had been his livelihood for so many years. The neighbors, initially wary of the new inhabitant, soon began to come with work. Horseshoes that needed replacement, tools that required repair, metal objects of all kinds that Thomas transformed with his expert hands and trained eye. Jamie had turned 1 year old, and with him came the first faltering steps, the first babbled words, the first laughs that illuminated the cabin like rays of sunshine. Clara observed him grow with a mixture of pride and nostalgia, aware of how quickly time passed, of how each day the baby became a little more a child, gradually moving away from the complete dependence of his first months. One particularly beautiful afternoon, Clara decided it was time to visit the grove of wild plum trees again. Jamie was now old enough to appreciate the beauty of the place, and something in her heart told her it was important to share this sacred space with him, as her father had shared it with her. Elias and Thomas were busy in the blacksmith shop, working on a special order for the town doctor. Clara informed them of her plans and left with Jamie mounted on Penny, the mule that Elias had tamed years ago, and that now, in her old age, was the most docile and reliable animal. On the farm, the path to the grove was clearer than she remembered, as if it had been regularly traveled during her absence. Clara wondered if Elias had been visiting the place without telling her, seeking there the connection with memories. That meant so much to both. Upon reaching the clearing, she dismounted carefully, holding Jamie with one arm while tying Penny to a nearby tree. The grove was in full bloom, the plum trees covered with small white flowers that perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance. Jamie extended his little hands toward the petals floating in the breeze, his eyes enormous with wonder at the natural spectacle. Clara sat under the largest tree, the one where her father had taught her to climb, and sat Jamie in her lap. She told him about the grandfather he would never know, of how he had shown her to listen to the voice of the earth, to read the signs of the sky, to respect herself and others. "Someday I'll teach you to climb this tree," she promised, kissing the child's head, "as my father taught me, and we'll gather plums together and make pies and preserves for winter." Jamie listened with the intermittent attention proper to his age, more interested in the insects that buzzed among the flowers than in his mother's words. But Clara knew that something of what she said would remain engraved in some corner of his memory, forming part of the foundations on which he would build his identity. While Jamie crawled on the grass, exploring his surroundings with the insatiable curiosity of childhood, Clara closed her eyes and allowed herself to fully feel the moment. The warm sun on her skin, the sweet aroma of the flowers, the whisper of leaves stirred by the breeze, the occasional gurgle of her son discovering some new marvel. A deep peace enveloped her, different from anything she had experienced before. It wasn't the tense quietness of the solitude she had known after her father's death, not even the satisfied calm she had found in her life with Elias. It was something more complete, more rooted, the sensation of having completed a circle, of being exactly where she should be, at the exact time she should be there. The sound of approaching hooves pulled her from her reverie. She opened her eyes to see Elias dismounting from his horse, his figure silhouetted against the golden light of the afternoon. He didn't seem surprised to find her there. It was as if he had known exactly where to look for her. "Thomas stayed with the order," he explained as he approached. "I thought I might join you for a while." Clara smiled, extending her hand toward him in a silent invitation. Elias sat beside her, picking up Jamie, who immediately climbed onto his lap, fascinated as always by the pocket watch his father carried with him. For a time, they simply sat there, absorbing the beauty of the place, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by an invisible yet unbreakable bond. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Clara finally asked, resting her head on Elias's shoulder. "Every detail," he responded, his deep voice mixing with the whisper of the leaves. "You were nervous. So was I, though I tried not to show it. And I confessed to you that I had never been kissed," she added, smiling at the memory. "And I felt like the luckiest man in the world," completed Elias, taking her hand and intertwining his fingers with hers. Jamie, bored with the adult conversation, had moved a few meters away to chase a butterfly, his crystalline laughter resonating among the trees like music. "Are you happy, Clara?" Elias suddenly asked, with a seriousness that contrasted with the lightness of the moment. Clara looked at him, surprised by the question. It was an inversion of that other night, years ago, when she had asked him the same thing on the porch of the cabin. "More than I thought possible," she responded, using exactly the same words he had used then. Elias smiled, recognizing the reference. His free hand rose to touch Clara's cheek, a gesture so familiar but that never lost its capacity to make her feel deeply loved. "I still can't believe you let me stay that first night," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "A stranger soaked by the rain, with a dark past and an uncertain future." "You had good hands," she responded with a playful smile, "and I needed someone to repair the chicken coop roof." Elias laughed, a full and free sound that Clara never tired of hearing, so different from the contained and cautious laugh of their early days together. "I'm glad to have been useful," he said, leaning to kiss her softly. Jamie returned running toward them, tripping in his enthusiasm and falling onto the grass. Before he could begin to cry, Elias lifted him in the air, spinning him until his fright transformed into delighted laughter. Clara observed them, this man who had entered her life like the storm that accompanied him that distant night, transforming everything in his path, and this child who was the physical manifestation of the love they had built together, as unexpected as it was precious. The sun began to descend, tinting the grove with golden and reddish tones. It was time to return. They mounted again, Jamie secure in Elias's arms as they rode toward the cabin, that now housed not just a solitary woman, but a complete family. As they advanced through the prairies, Clara contemplated the landscape that extended around them, so familiar and yet always changing. The wind blew gently, creating waves in the tall grass that recalled the movement of the sea she had never seen, but imagined in her dreams. And in that wind, in that constant murmur of the prairies, she believed she heard echoes, her father's, laugh teaching her to ride, the stories her mother told her before sleep, the first "I love you" whispered by Elias in the intimacy of night, Jamie's cry at birth. All the voices, all the sounds that had woven the fabric of her life, intertwined in a symphony that only she could hear. She smiled to herself, grateful for each step of the path, even the most painful ones, that had led her to this moment. For the solitude that had taught her strength, for the loss that had shown her the value of what remained, for the fear that had given way to courage, for the silence that had created space for new voices. Upon reaching the cabin, Thomas awaited them. On the porch, his elderly but dignified figure silhouetted against the warm light emanating from within. Jamie extended his arms toward his grandfather as soon as he saw him, and the old man received him with the radiant smile that only grandchildren can provoke. While Elias took care of the horses, Clara paused a moment before entering, contemplating the scene, the smoke rising from the chimney forming spirals against the sky that began to darken, the lit lights that converted the windows into golden rectangles of welcome, the intermingled laughter of Jamie and Thomas that reached her from the interior. And she knew, with an absolute certainty that filled her chest with an expanding warmth, that she had found her place in the world. It wasn't just the cabin, nor the land that surrounded it, nor even the people who now inhabited it with her. It was all of this and something more, the peace of knowing herself, part of something larger than herself, of a cycle of life, death, and rebirth that would continue long after she was gone, like the wild plum trees that blossomed every spring, without caring who was there to see them. Elias returned to her side, surrounding her waist with an arm in a protective gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Clara nodded, leaning against him, absorbing his warmth and his strength. "Just listening," she responded. "To what?" he asked with curiosity. She smiled, not knowing how to explain the depth of what she felt, the connection she perceived with everything that surrounded her. "To the murmur of the prairies," she said finally, "to the story they tell." Elias didn't ask more, understanding intuitively what she meant. Together they entered the cabin, closing the door behind them. Outside, the wind continued its eternal dance among the tall grass, carrying with it the echoes of all the lives that had passed through those lands. Natives who had honored its spirit, pioneers who had sought a new beginning, families who had put down roots in its fertile soil, and now interwoven with all those stories, that of Clara Whitmore and Elias Boone. Two solitary souls who had found in each other a home more permanent than any wooden structure, deeper than any root, more enduring than any season. A story of loss and discovery, of pain and healing, of solitude and connection. A story that would continue transforming and growing, like the small plum tree planted for Jamie, like the love that had blossomed between them against all odds, in the very heart of the vast and solitary prairies of Montana